The mission was supposed to take 4 hours. By hour 6, Warrant Officer Sina Drayton was alone, wounded, and 40 kilometers inside territory where every living person who wasn't her was authorized to kill her on sight. By hour 8, she'd stopped thinking about rescue. By hour 9, she'd stopped thinking about survival as an abstract concept and started thinking about it as a series of very specific problems that needed to be solved in a very specific order before the sun came up, and turned the darkness that was currently keeping her alive into a liability that would get her killed. She had 9 problems, 7 of them were men. The other 2 were the bullet crease along her left ribs that had stopped bleeding but hadn't stopped hurting, and the fact that her primary radio was at the bottom of a river 3 kilometers east, along with the rest of her team's equipment, along with her team, who were either dead or captured, and whom she was choosing not to think about yet because thinking about them right now would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend. She was crouched in the dark at the base of a collapsed wall on the outskirts of a village that had been abandoned for years. The buildings around her were hollow shells, roofs caved in, walls stripped of anything useful long ago. The vegetation had been reclaiming the streets for a decade. Thorns and climbing vines and opportunistic trees growing up through cracked concrete. It was the kind of place that showed up on maps as a name with nothing attached to it anymore. The kind of place nobody came to unless they were running from something or hunting something. Tonight it was both. Sina had been running for 3 hours. Now she was going to stop running. She pressed her back against the wall and took inventory in the dark by touch, the way she'd been trained to, the way she'd practiced 1,000 times until her hands could catalog everything without her eyes. Her secondary weapon, a suppressed pistol with 2 full magazines, 11 rounds each, 22 rounds total. Her fixed blade knife, 8 inches, the one her instructor at selection had told her was too heavy, and she'd carried anyway for 11 years because he'd been wrong. A tourniquet she hadn't needed yet, 4 zip ties, a compass that didn't require batteries, a length of paracord, a single protein bar she'd been saving for a moment worse than this one, and she decided this was now that moment. She ate half of it, she saved the other half. She thought about the 7 men. She'd seen them for the first time 4 hours ago when everything had gone wrong. They were a security detail, well-trained, well-equipped, operating on home terrain in darkness they were comfortable with. There were originally 9 of them. 2 had made mistakes in the first hour of the pursuit and were no longer factors. 7 remained. They were spread across a search pattern that covered the terrain between the river to the east and the hills to the west, which was also the terrain she needed to cross to reach the extraction point, which was in those hills, which was where the secondary radio was, which was how she was going to call in the kind of help that might, if the timing worked, salvage something from this night that wasn't a complete catastrophe. The extraction point was 11 kilometers away. 11 kilometers of open terrain, with 7 trained men between her and it. She could try to go around them. She'd considered it. The search pattern they were running was standard grid coverage, disciplined, the kind of pattern that accounted for a fugitive trying to find gaps in the net. Going around meant going north, adding at least 15 kilometers to the route, which meant arriving at the extraction point well after sunrise, which meant the window for the secondary radio would be closed, which meant she'd be on foot in open terrain in daylight with no communication, and a wound that was going to start seriously limiting her mobility in approximately 4 hours regardless of how well she managed it. Going around wasn't a real option. That left going through. She thought about the 7 men. She thought about their positions as she'd last seen them, the spacing of their pattern, the communication rhythm she'd been listening to on the frequency she wasn't supposed to be able to access, but could because she'd spent 2 years learning to work with signals equipment before she'd been selected, and she'd never stopped being the kind of person who quietly retained useful skills. They were checking in every 20 minutes. Standard protocol. The kind of protocol that had a gap built into it. a gap between check-ins where a team member could deviate from their last reported position without triggering an immediate response. 20 minutes per gap, 7 men, 7 individual problems. 7 individual solutions. She stood up. She oriented herself with the compass. She started moving northeast, not toward the extraction point, but toward the position of the man she designated in her head as Target 1, because she'd watched him for long enough to know he was working alone on the eastern edge of the pattern, and alone was where she needed to start. She moved through the abandoned village in absolute silence, which was not difficult for her in a place like this. She had a quality that her teammates had described in various ways over the years. One had called it negative space. Another had called it aggressive stillness. Her first training cadre had simply noted in her file that she moved as though she'd been there before, which wasn't true but communicated something real about how she operated. She didn't fight the environment. She became it. She matched her pace to the ambient sounds. She used the wind when it moved through the vegetation to cover her own movement. She put her feet down the way the ground wanted to receive them, rather than the way that was most convenient for her. She reached the eastern edge of the village in 11 minutes. Target 1 was exactly where she expected him to be. He was positioned at the corner of a crumbled building 60 meters north of the village boundary, kneeling behind the remains of a low wall, watching the open ground to the east with his rifle up. He was good. His position was smart. His sight lines covered the two most obvious approaches from the river. He was watching the wrong direction. Sina came from the west, from inside the village, from the one direction his position had left open because it was the direction he'd come from, and human beings, even trained ones, found it genuinely difficult to maintain equal vigilance on the direction they perceived as safe. It was a persistent cognitive pattern that training addressed and experience sometimes overcame and exhaustion always eroded, and this man had been running a search pattern for 3 hours in the dark and he was tired. She put him down quietly and quickly, and without any of the theatrical elaboration that appeared in movies. He would wake up with a headache and a bad day. That was acceptable. She was not here to kill anyone she didn't have to kill. She had decided that 2 hours ago when she'd stopped running and started thinking, because the arithmetic of this situation had a specific answer, and that answer required 7 solutions but didn't require 7 bodies, and she intended to honor that distinction for as long as the situation permitted it. She zip-tied his wrists and ankles. She took his radio. She took his water. She left him behind the wall where nobody would look for him for at least 15 minutes and possibly longer. She moved. Target 2 was further north, 300 meters into the open ground beyond the village. She reached him in 18 minutes, which left her 2 minutes before the next check-in. She used those 2 minutes and she used the radio she'd taken from Target 1 to answer Target 2's call sign when the check-in came, keeping the transmission brief, the way a man who'd found nothing would keep it, which was how she knew what to say. 6 remained. She moved west now, toward the hills, because the pattern she'd observed had a seam in it, a place where 2 coverage areas met, and the responsibility for that ground was theoretically shared but practically claimed by neither. The kind of dead zone that emerged in any sufficiently complex pattern, when the people running it were tired and working from a plan that had been designed for a different situation than the one that had actually developed tonight. She moved through the seam. It bought her 2 kilometers before she had to stop and reassess. The terrain had changed. The abandoned village was behind her. Ahead was open agricultural ground, fields that had gone fallow and grown into waist-high grass and scrub, cut through with irrigation ditches that were dry now but deep enough to move through at a crouch. Beyond the fields, the ground began to rise toward the hills. The extraction point was 9 kilometers ahead. Targets 3 and 4 were in those fields. She knew their approximate positions from the pattern, but approximate was doing significant work in that sentence, because they'd been moving for 3 hours, and their actual positions were now somewhere within a 100-meter radius of where she'd last clocked them, which was too wide a margin in terrain like this. She needed to locate them before she moved into the fields. She lay down in the grass at the field's edge and listened. She controlled her breathing, slowing it below the level where it created audible sound, a technique she'd practiced so many times it had become reflexive. She listened to the field. It took 4 minutes. Then she heard it, the specific quality of a footstep in dry grass, the compression and release, the slight delay that distinguished a human foot from the small animals that were also moving through this field tonight. Target 3 was moving south to north, 40 meters to her left, which put him 200 meters east of Target 4 based on the pattern spacing she'd observed. She gave him 90 seconds to move further north. Then she entered the field and went south, moving parallel to Target 3's track but in the opposite direction, using his movement to determine the safe edges of her own. She found Target 4 in a dry irrigation ditch, sitting with his back against the east wall, rifle across his knees, looking north. He was drinking from a water bottle. He was watching the wrong direction again. The irrigation ditch had seemed like an excellent observation point from the north side because it gave him elevation above the field to the north. From the south side, it was a coffin. She dealt with Target 4 in 40 seconds. She had used all 4 zip ties. She improvised with his bootlaces, which were not ideal but would hold him long enough. She took his radio. She took his rifle sling and his water. 4 down, 3 remaining. She moved nor-northwest, angling toward the base of the hills, using the ditch system to cover ground quickly. The wound along her ribs was producing a specific quality of pain now, not the sharp, immediate pain of fresh injury, but the deep, dull burn that meant the tissue was beginning to respond to what had happened to it, which meant she had approximately 3 hours before it started seriously affecting her movement, which meant she needed to be at the extraction point in 2. She was 7 kilometers away. She started running. Not the full sprint that exhausted and announced and left you with nothing for the problem that came after. The steady ground-eating pace she'd learned from a long-distance runner on her 3rd deployment who had told her that speed was a trap and distance was the answer, and she'd tested that theory enough times in enough places to know it was mostly right. She ran through the fallow fields with her head low and her footfalls light, and the 3 radios she was now carrying distributed across her kit to balance the weight. She was 4 kilometers from the base of the hills when she had to stop. Target 5 had moved. She nearly ran into him. Literally, within 30 feet, which was close enough that she stopped and went flat before he saw her, close enough that she could hear him breathing, close enough that she understood he had abandoned his assigned position and moved significantly south and west of where the pattern said he should be. She lay in the grass and watched him. He was standing still, facing east, listening, not looking, listening, which meant he was good enough to know that his ears were more reliable than his eyes in this darkness, and that meant she needed to be more careful with him than she'd been with the others. She studied his position for 3 minutes. She mapped his sight lines, his dead zones, his posture, the direction his weight was distributed, the quality of his attention. She was looking for the moment when his concentration peaked and then inevitably, briefly, relaxed, because sustained maximum attention was physiologically impossible, and the human nervous system always found a way to take a fraction of a second to consolidate, to recalibrate, to breathe. She waited for that fraction of a second. It came at minute 4. She moved in the 3 seconds before his attention returned to full alert, crossing the ground between them in a way that put her in his blind spot. And by the time his nervous system had recalibrated, she was already behind him, and the problem was resolved. Target 5 was the most capable of the 7. She acknowledged that mentally. He deserved the acknowledgement. He'd done everything right except account for someone who'd been doing this for 11 years in places that made tonight look manageable. 5 down, 2 remaining. She took his rifle. She checked its configuration in the dark. It was a better platform than she'd had going into this, and she needed a better platform for what was coming, because the last two men in this pattern were not going to be managed quietly, and she knew it. She'd known it since hour 8 when she'd been working through the 7 problems in order of solvability, and had arrived at the last two and understood that they were different. They were positioned on the high ground at the base of the hills, covering the approach to the extraction route, which meant they were positioned specifically to stop someone trying to get to exactly where she was trying to get to. They were the net's closing mechanism. They were there because whoever had designed this search pattern had understood that the terrain drove a fugitive toward the hills and had placed his best assets where the terrain forced the problem to arrive. She had 2 assets of her own. The first was that she knew exactly where they were. The second was that they didn't know she was coming this way. They knew someone was running the pattern they'd been assigned to catch. They didn't know that 5 of the 7 people between her and them were currently zip-tied or improvised restrained in various positions across the terrain behind her. They were expecting her to be tired, frightened, and cornered. She was 2 of those things. She reached the base of the hills 40 minutes before sunrise. The 2 men were positioned as she'd expected, one on a rocky outcrop to the north covering the main approach trail, one in a tree line to the south covering the alternate route. Between them was a gap of approximately 200 meters of open ground that anyone approaching the hills from the east would have to cross. Sina sat in the last cover before the open ground and thought about it for 4 minutes. Then she did something that went against every instinct and every piece of tactical wisdom she'd accumulated in 11 years, which was why it was going to work. She stood up. She stepped out of the cover. She walked directly into the open ground, unhurried, heading north, angling toward the outcrop where Target 6 was positioned, making no attempt whatsoever to conceal her presence. The man in the southern tree line saw her first. She heard him key his radio and speak quickly. She kept walking. She heard Target 6 on the outcrop shift position to cover her. She kept walking. She counted on them doing exactly what trained personnel do when a target presents itself unexpectedly and openly in a situation that was supposed to be a pursuit, which was to hesitate and communicate and wait for confirmation before acting, because open and calm didn't match the threat picture they'd been working with for 3 hours, and the human brain, even the trained one, took a moment to resolve that mismatch. She used that moment. She was 30 meters from the outcrop when Target 6 called out to her in the local language, demanding identification. She answered him in the same language, which she spoke well enough for the dark and the distance, keeping her voice calm, walking toward him, and in the 3 seconds it took him to process the fact that she'd answered at all and in his language and without the expected fear, she covered the last 30 meters and the problem was resolved. Target 7 in the southern tree line had seen what happened. She knew that. She didn't try to conceal it. She turned and looked directly at the tree line and stood in the open and waited. After 30 seconds, a figure emerged from the trees. He was walking toward her. His rifle was at a low ready, not raised, not slung. He stopped 20 meters away and looked at her. He was young, mid-20s. He had the build and the posture of someone who'd been doing this work for 3 or 4 years, enough to be competent, not quite enough to be the thing she was. He looked at Target 6, who was not injured but was not currently able to do anything about the situation, and he looked at Sina, and he appeared to be performing a calculation. She waited for him to finish it. He lowered his rifle. He sat down on the ground. He put his hands on his knees. She walked over to him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said in his language, smart. He looked up at her. He said, "You're going to the hills." She said, "Yes." He said, "The radio is on the 3rd peak. They moved it 2 days ago. The position on the satellite maps is wrong." She studied him. "3rd peak," she said. He nodded. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because 6 of my colleagues are currently unable to tell anyone anything, and you did that without killing any of them, and I would like to remain in the same category." She looked at him for another moment. Then she zip-tied him with the last of Target 5's bootlaces and the length of paracord from her kit, and left him sitting against a tree on the edge of the open ground, alive and uninjured, and with a clear view of the hills she was walking into. She reached the third peak 40 minutes before the extraction window closed. The secondary radio was exactly where he'd said it was. She keyed it. She gave her call sign and her position and a situation report that took 90 seconds to deliver and covered, in compressed and precise language, everything that had happened in the last 9 hours. She included the team's last known position. She included what she'd learned about the search pattern and the 7 men and the terrain between the river and the hills. She included a request for immediate extraction and a secondary request for a search and recovery operation for her team. The voice that came back was a woman she recognized, Major Celeste Ibarra, the operations officer who'd been running the mission from the command element, who had a reputation for composure that Cena had always respected, and who now sounded like someone who'd been spending the last several hours in a state of controlled crisis. Ibarra said, "Drayton, confirm your status." Cena said, "Ambulatory, 1 minor wound. 7 contacts neutralized, non-lethal, position secure." There was a pause, then Ibarra said, "Non-lethal." Cena said, "Correct." Another pause. "How?" Cena said, "Carefully." She heard something on the other end of the radio that might have been a laugh that Ibarra immediately suppressed. Then Ibarra said, "Extraction in 22 minutes. Third peak, confirmed. Do you need medical?" Cena said, "Affirmative, nothing critical, 22 minutes is fine." She sat down with her back against the rock and looked east, where the darkness was beginning, very slightly, to qualify itself, the horizon showing the first gray suggestion of what was coming. The stars were still hard and clear overhead. The wind had picked up coming off the hills, and it was cold, and she was wet from the irrigation ditches, and the wound along her ribs was burning steadily. But she was breathing and thinking, and the radio was in her hand, and the extraction was 22 minutes away. She thought about her team. She thought about the information she'd passed to Ibarra and what the search and recovery operation would find. She had done what she could with what she had. She would know more in 22 minutes. Until then, the thinking about it was spending something she needed to conserve. She thought about the young man at the tree line instead. The calculation she'd watched him make. The specific intelligence it took to arrive at the correct answer when the correct answer required you to put your weapon down. She thought about what he'd told her about the radio, which she'd confirmed with her own eyes, which meant he'd been telling the truth, which meant the calculation he'd made had included the decision to be genuinely useful rather than merely compliant. She had noted his face. She had noted the specific way he moved and the quality of his observation and the 3-second pause before he'd lowered his rifle that told her the decision had been real, not reflexive. She filed all of it away in the part of her mind where things went that might matter later, because she'd been in this work long enough to know that the world was smaller than it appeared, and the people you encountered in it had a way of mattering in directions you didn't anticipate. The extraction came in at minute 21. It was a small helicopter, running dark, coming in from the west along the ridge line. It set down in a flat section 20 meters from her position and kept its rotors turning. She walked to it without hurrying. She climbed in. The door closed behind her. Ibarra was not on the helicopter. The 2 people on it were a crew chief and a medic, and the medic immediately began assessing her ribs while the helicopter lifted off and turned west, leaving the hills and the open ground, and the 7 men she'd left in various positions of secured helplessness behind her in the dark. The medic said, 2 cracked ribs, maybe 3. We won't know until imaging. Cena said, "The wound." The medic said, "Superficial. You're going to be sore for a month." Cena said, "What about the team?" The medic looked at her. He said, "We have a recovery element moving. We'll know more in the next hour." She said, "All of them." He said, "We're going for all of them. That's all I know right now." She looked out the window at the darkness moving past. The gray in the east had deepened slightly. Not sunrise yet, not quite, but coming. The night she'd been moving through for 9 hours was running out of itself. She thought about the 9 problems. She thought about the 7 solutions. She thought about the moment she'd stood up in the open ground and walked toward Target 6 and the specific kind of commitment that required. The willingness to trust a plan completely enough to present yourself as the most obvious possible target, which was also, when the plan was right, the safest thing you could do. She thought about the fraction of a second she waited for in every problem, the moment of recalibration, the brief systemic pause that every person carried inside them whether they knew it or not. She thought about 11 years, the places they'd taken her, the things they'd shown her, the particular education that came from surviving situations that were trying to kill you, which was the most complete education she knew of and which cost more than any other kind. The medic handed her water. She drank it. The crew chief said, "ETA 18 minutes." She said, "Thank you." She looked east one more time. The gray had become something more than gray now, a thin line of distinction between earth and sky that was going to be light in another 30 minutes whether the night wanted it to or not. She had made it before sunrise. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes, and in the 18 minutes before the helicopter landed, she allowed herself to rest in the specific way she'd learned to rest in situations like this. Not sleeping, not exactly, but setting down the weight of active vigilance for a defined period, trusting the crew and the aircraft and the 18 minutes to be what they were. When the helicopter touched down, she opened her eyes immediately. She was already thinking about the next problem. She always was.